And again, I want to say that this is just my perspective. I'm using psychological models, and what I've done is just simply found models that I felt like were the closest to direct experience that both I had and the students I work with. So there's other models. If you're familiar with another model that makes more sense to you, then that's perfectly fine. But this is just what works for me in my teaching and practice. So the self-identity really is composed of who and what we take ourselves to be. And a lot of this starts when we're little. The framing, the understanding that I like to use is when we're born into what is referred to as the dual unity. And the unity part is the baby doesn't see themselves as separate from anything. The baby is undifferentiated. And I don't know if you've held newborns, but when I've held my kids and grandkids, there's just this sense of oneness, of unity, that it's easy to drop into with the infant, because the infant doesn't know how to differentiate. It doesn't know who it is compared to who I am. It just feels everything is the same unity or oneness. And then over time, the infant recognizes that discomfort, pain, suffering is inside, is at this location of this physicality. So basically the hunger, the need for affection, for clean clothes is felt in this location, and the solution comes from the outside. We can't self-generate food as an infant. We can't change our own clothes, things like that. And so we begin to recognize, oh, okay, I'm here, I'm in this location, this is my pain, and the food or solutions outside. So that begins the creation of the sense of self, and also taking the unity and creating a duality out of it. I'm here, you're there, I'm hungry, food is there. So it begins that structuring. And since most of our birth families and caregivers are operating out of a belief in a duality and a separate self, that becomes the modeling that we recognize. And our dependence on the adults is so strong that we invest in their worldview, which is the sense of self. And for all of us, there's a turn away, where this time when we're steeped in unity, we're resting in presence and love, presence most particularly. And when we do the turn away to the birth family and duality, there's a sense of abandonment. And the infant, interestingly, takes it as their failure. Most of us hold a self-definition down deep that there's something wrong. There's something missing. I'm hopeless, helpless, bad, unlovable, broken, something like that. There's some story down there at the real base of a kind of failure, a kind of inferiority. And that becomes the building block for personality, where we develop personality based on, again, our early life, how we fit into these different places. And part of that is the personality has a lot of behavior to convince ourselves and others that that perception of inferiority is not true. It doesn't exist. So we show all the good stuff, in effect, to those around us, and then that's what we want to see mirrored back to us. And when they mirror back the good stuff to us, you're smart, you're successful, you're good looking, whatever it is that's being mirrored, we begin to add that into our self-definition. And this would also be if there's negative comments made. You're not that bright, you're not that coordinated, you're not that athletic, whatever it is, that becomes part of our self-definition. We may not want to identify with it, but it is part of the structuring. And so when in life someone mirrors what we think are positive personality traits or behaviors, we're related. They get me, they see me. And conversely, if they don't mirror that, if they mirror a part of us that we don't like, that we don't want to associate with, we feel unseen. They don't get me, they don't know me, they're not seeing the real me. So it's this constant maneuvering through society where we want people to see what we're good at, what we think they should see, and we don't want them to mirror or reflect what we're, the places in us that are hurt and where we may feel broken or damaged. We don't want that to happen. And so part of the development of absence of self on a spiritual path is we begin to unhook from these different self-definitions. We begin to let them get more and more transparent. And we do this through meditation, through contact with the Absolute, through learning to develop trust in the Absolute. That's why I named my last book Trust and Awakening. We begin by having faith. Our teachers or others that are experienced will give us some confidence in the path, and we begin to, again, loosen some self-definition. In my teaching, that's why I emphasize the heart practices, what are called the Brahma Viharas in Theravada Buddhism, which means the divine abodes. And by working with those, we not only open to and establish a relationship, a flow of the heart qualities of the Absolute, which are objective and always present, and they're universal in their application. So it isn't that I have to perform any particular way to have access to these heart qualities. They're always available to each of us. And this lets us relax some of the self-definition, the heart qualities, and we begin to have the ability to look at our own suffering, our own problem behaviors, all the ways that we're dysfunctional. We can begin to look at those, and we can either correct those, or we can recognize those as a self-definition that may not be accurate. So there's both the refinement of the personality. We're getting to be better functioning humans through our spiritual practice, particularly the heart qualities. And then once we have enough stability in that, then it gives us more confidence, more ability to let go of self-definition when we're in relationship, in contact with the Absolute directly. And that allows us to ultimately let go of self-identity entirely. And that's when there's the possibility of the Absolute awakening to itself in a particular consciousness. So awakening becomes a possibility. And awakening is very mysterious. It isn't like there's a set prescription. If we do so many of these and don't do so many of those, that it's going to happen for everyone. Everyone has their own composition. And there's a certain amount of grace that's part of the process as well. One of the things I've been seeing with my students is that a lot of the guided meditations have either opened people to awakening, the first level I call Kensho, or after the guided meditations, often people, if they're out for a walk in nature, that also becomes a spark. So I'm seeing that those, and this is why I use the guided meditations, because they're having a beneficial impact on folks. So interestingly, when we first come in contact with absence of self, again, if I asked you, who are you? And you weren't able to give me an answer, for most people it's disconcerting, it's unsettling. And so they quickly turn to the different markers of me. Again, my things about my body, things about my age, my work, where I live, all these different markers. We reassert those, and then we feel comfortable. The self is reestablished. But over time, we gain more comfort in not knowing, in touching in and not seeing who we are. But people can feel a variety of qualities that can be surprising. They can feel lost without that anchor of the me. They can feel a certain quality or tone of hopelessness. all is lost because I don't know who I am. There can be a sense of defeat even. I'm doing something wrong. I've lost myself. And there can be a inner depression or sadness some people will go through, where even though we're aspiring to awaken, to have the absolute awaken to itself, at the same time, most of us carry the picture that my personality is what's going to awaken. And it's a very rude realization to those people to understand that the personality doesn't awaken. That's not what happens. It happens in consciousness and awareness, and then it will influence the sense of self, the personality, but it doesn't, the personality itself doesn't, it's not part of the awakening process. And the flip side of that is, as we're getting more and more contact with absence of self, and that means the periods of absence of self are lasting longer. In my experience, I had experiences that were, or times that were weeks or months where I had no sense of self. And you can function completely. You understand how the world works. You understand your job and relationships. There just isn't a me that's driving that anymore. There's just this absence. And so we get more and more comfortable. And at the same time, our comfort is growing in absence of self. There's a kind of staleness that we begin to experience with the personality. Like we're watching the same show we've seen 100 times. We know how it works. We know where the breaks are. We know what the storyline is. And so it gets kind of old and stale, a little bit uncomfortable. Some people can even feel it like they're in clothing that's a little too small. They feel confined and tight. And some folks will feel a kind of shell or an outer armoring that they'll begin to make contact with. And that's all part of the process as well. And as we're moving deeper into absence of self, we're opening to greater and greater spaciousness. So a kind of unrestrained experience becomes more readily accessible. And over time, people develop more and more comfort, more ease as they're experiencing the absence of self and perhaps making contact with the absolute. First, it's based on faith, what you may have read or what a teacher or other may have suggested to you or presented to you as a practice. And over time, that faith gets replaced by trust. We have experience. For those of you that were in contact with the velvety smoothness of the absolute, that's something you know now. That's your experience. You don't need me to say it or reference it for you to know that's true. And so we want to recognize when we have these experiences and can put things in the truth basket, as it were, rather than in the faith basket. We know it's true. And that trust builds to where we get to where we can let go of the sense of self. We can embrace and open to and be surrendered to the absolute, which is part of the awakening experience. Now, one thing I want to say is after Kensho, there sometimes are beliefs people hold that the sense of self or the personality is going to disappear forever. And that isn't actually how it works. Normally with an initial awakening, even the first few awakenings, the sense of self returns after a period of time. For some people it can be a minute or 5 minutes of a Kensho experience where they have all three components I mentioned earlier. For others it'll last weeks or even months. And in the Zen tradition, that's where we refer to a Kensho as being shallow or deep, how long the sense of self is suspended and the absolute is functioning freely in that individual. But at some point, the personality material begins to reassert itself. And we begin to have times when we're steeped in the silence, the stillness, the perfection of the absolute, that vast spaciousness. and other times we'll be in the personality. We'll be triggered by events. We have unconscious and subconscious material that will begin to percolate up to the surface as well. And so this becomes the journey post-Kensho. It's working with the personality material. It's recognizing why we do these different behaviors. And it's slowly liberating each of these behaviors when we're ready to let go, when we don't need that anymore, when we discover it's not ultimately true. We begin to let go. So again, the behavior begins to change too, because we're letting go of habituated patterns and stock responses. I'm sure you've all had the experience post-retreat or post some deep experience where you'll see someone behave in a way or speak in a way that normally is triggering to you, and you watch the behavior and you see, oh yes, here's routine 5A where I'm going to react this way, and it just passes right through. I wrote, I think in Buddha's Heart, that it was ironic to me that the place that I felt the safest was when I was the most vulnerable, the most open. So that allowed me to be open and to have all these previous triggering events happen, and there was no response, there was no trigger. And that doesn't mean that any one of us can't be triggered, because again, there's a lot of unconscious material that we carry. So the spiritual path post-Kensho is working with whatever's arising, at the same time orienting to and opening to the absolute. So it's this sort of two-step process. I call it the stair-step method. We either have a deep realization or realization of some kind, and then that highlights the behavior that's discordant with that understanding. And so we work the personality material sufficiently where it can drop or be digested, and then we become ready for the next level of realization, the next step. And then that will highlight the personality material that's incongruent with that realization. So it just continues. And as far as I can tell, there's no end to the personal material that will need to be worked, nor is there an end to realization. They're both, I view them both as endless. So we're just constantly on the path doing these practices that steep us in the absolute and also work the personality material. So that's a lot of the work I do with people post-Kensho. I work with them privately on these kinds of issues. You've read, those of you that have read Demystifying Awakening know that in the Zen model that I work with, there's the different realizations of Kensho, Satori, and Daigo Teitei. And the Satori is a more sustained realization. With the Kensho, typically we'll have that experience of the absolute, but it isn't, the consciousness hasn't been awakened greater than 51%. And this is sort of an unofficial way I talk about it and work with it. But with the Satori, what characterizes the Satori experience is that at least 51% of consciousness has awakened, the absolute has awakened to itself. And when that happens, our foundation, our inner foundation, shifts from the personality, the sense of self, to true nature. And remember, I use the word true nature or term true nature to mean the absolute in this consciousness. So the absolute in this consciousness becomes our foundation rather than the sense of self. And that also changes how we work with personality material, because there's less identification. We have a more objective view about our inclinations and our patterns. And then later, there's the possibility of the Daigo Teitei realization, which in Japanese means final or full realization or awakening. Now, it isn't actually the final or full. Again, I believe there's an endless supply of these. One of the great Zen masters, Hakuin from Japan, is said to have had 17 major awakenings and countless minor awakenings. So even this quite realized master identified at least 17, again, big realizations that he had. And so one of the practices that I teach is the silent illumination or shikantaza of Zen, which is really a great practice to open to the absolute. And we'll practice that a little bit later today and then tomorrow as well. Let me just pause here and see if there's any questions. Yeah, and for me, I use the term consciousness to mean awareness with self-referencing or referencing of concepts. So it would be awareness can be pure, can be non-conceptual, or it can be conceptual. And the consciousness is I'm relating it to memories from my life, from my structuring of the world. I believe the world works in a certain way. And so that's my consciousness from my experience. That's how I differentiate those. I know others may do it differently, but for me, again, the terms I use are based on practice, are based on experience rather than a conceptual understanding. I try to find the closest term to match the experience. The one difference between the Kensho and Satori, again, that 51% is just a term I use, but it seems to me if the Kensho, what happens is if the Kensho is deep enough, there's this kind of shift that happens where rather than the sense of self and the world view being our base of operation or identity, the absolute in this consciousness. So it isn't the absolute in its purest form, it's the absolute functioning in this consciousness becomes the foundation, and that's what I call true nature. So yeah, but that becomes the base of operation, even though there may be times when we're not aware of it, when we're caught up in our ideas and sense of self. But when we're in our most relaxed times, that's what we're going to feel as the base. We don't need to do anything. That's what's there. So it's kind of like the waves on the ocean have to still enough. And then when they do, we recognize, oh, there's this great still ocean here. And with the Daigo Teitei realization, the absolute itself becomes the foundation in that awareness. So rather than it being having particular qualities that are evident in this body and this life experience, it's the objectiveness and the universalness of the absolute that becomes the foundation. And that's a fairly rare realization. In my unofficial, I guess, checking with teachers, I've only found a few teachers that have had the experience, and now there's a couple of students who have had that experience too. So it is potential, but it requires the resolution of that core egoic deficiency or that core dysfunction, the belief in that core dysfunction breaks down. So that's a fairly deep psychological state as well. We have to do a lot of personality work to get to the core and have that be resolved. And interestingly, that Daigo Teitei also unfolds slowly. So rather than the Kensho and Satori can be a flash or the snap of your fingers, the Daigo Teitei is very slow and deliberate, and there's choice points that we decide, left or right or up or down, whatever we'd use in language. But there's choice points we make to continue down this road. So yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I think that's a good clarification.